My name is Molly Burns. I am the reference librarian here, and this fall we have the theme of The Great Gatsby, or the 20s. This will be the 100th anniversary of this book, believe it or not. Actually, after the book came out and was going to be popular, there was a chance that they would actually have starred in a film, The Great Gatsby, but Scott kind of put a kibosh on it, but we're gonna leave that there. So they were the it couple of the 20s. They were almost famous for being famous, in an age before influencers, and their reputations are incredible for the things that they've done. Both brilliant writers, authors, and when they met, it was fireworks. So they had a very chaotic and passionate marriage. Their partying was legendary. There are stories of things that they did, and we'll get into that a little bit. But Scott actually used a lot of material from their relationship and their fights and their making up for his own books. And he might have stolen a couple words and journals from Zelda. Well, this is F. Scott, and he was born in 1896. And he's known for many books. His first breakout book was called This Side of Paradise, which the title actually came from Zelda. He kind of appropriated it because what he wanted to call it was The Romantic Egotists. And when they met and were walking, she went through the little graveyard in their town where her folks were, and she says, you know, I want to get the most out of life when I'm on this side of paradise. Hey, that sounds pretty good. That sounds real good. Actually, he didn't type. He was handwriting his books and manuscripts with pencil. And you can actually see some of those on the website of the museum. It's really fascinating. You can actually see his wiping out and rewriting. And then, of course, The Great Gatsby, which we're going to talk about. And all of these things, he was known for being a commentator also. And he commented a lot about the Jazz Age and the consumption and the trying to achieve the American dream. And you got to bear in mind that this was after the 1918 flu and the First World War. I mean, the whole world was at war. People were very much upset, but as a reaction to that, they kind of roared on back and decided, hey, we're going to live for today because who knows? So that's where the Roaring 20 comes from. They came back with a vengeance. So he did a lot of magazine articles, always in the newspaper, always giving his opinion, but he actually wrote a short story called The Jazz Age, which has little stories about different kind of people in it. But he actually came from a financially unstable environment. His dad was, now get this, a wicker furniture salesman in St. Paul, Minnesota. Okay? So no wonder Scott later on had some bad ideas about business, but yeah. So being unsuccessful in that, they ended up moving back to their hometown where his mother, she got an inheritance from her father, so that's how they existed. But his father was in and out of jobs. He couldn't. The only way they survived really to maintain their middle class status was through the mother's money, which made him a little more obsessed about money, especially when he went to Princeton and he's with what they called old wealth or old money, which is the old, anybody watch Gilded Age? That kind of thing, where these people have landed and they have inheritance. They have riches, and he realizes it's a lot different for him than his classmates. And he just he had like a love-hate relationship with money, really. And he did want that money and status, but on the other hand, he became very disillusioned with it. So he had very complicated feelings about money. And given that his father was in and out of work, it's kind of understandable. And here is our lovely Zelda Sayre. She is a daughter of an Alabama Supreme Court justice. She's the quintessential Southern belle. She's very witty. She's very artistic. She likes to write. She takes ballet lessons. And she was born in 1900. And what she and Scott found when they first met was they both had the same kind of idea that we need to live for today. Because tomorrow's not given. After the World War, anything could happen. So when they met, they had that philosophy, hey, let's have a good time. Let's live. And one of her quotes is, "I don't want to live, I want to love first and live incidentally." Isn't that nice? I really like this one too. Nobody has ever measured, not even poets, how much the heart can hold, which is also very nice. She was privileged. When she was around 15, 16, she became very popular in school, and she really kind of what you would call kind of boy crazy a little bit. And her father didn't want her to, go out past curfew and such, but he would lock her in her room and she would go out the window. When she was younger than that, she would dial up, they had a telephone, so she would dial up the fire department and report that somebody was stuck in a tree. Then she would hurry up and climb that tree because she liked the feeling and the drama of being rescued. Now, after a couple times, of course, they're not falling for it, but she is good at the artistic side. How romantic. Unfortunately, when she was about 15, two boys in her class basically assaulted her. And they told her that if a girl wants to stay popular, they have to do what boys say. So after this incident, her behavior and demeanor and everything changed. She went from being romantic, a daydreamer, to being very cynical, and then she was just gonna do whatever she wanted at this point. And she's like, I'm gonna dress the way I want. She was drinking gin, horrors, and smoking cigarettes. And she spent much of her time flirting with boys, but in her mind, she could hurry up and turn that off, She'd make them think that she may want to go with them, and then she's like, no. It was kind of her revenge, her power play in that case, because she lacked power during that incident. One of her other little nice things is, why should all life be work when we all can borrow? Let's think only of today and not worry about tomorrow. That's a good thought, and that was her philosophy, I'm just gonna do what I want to do. I'm gonna have fun, and nobody's gonna tell me how to dress. They're not gonna tell me I can't smoke, and they're not gonna tell me I can't anything. She was gonna do what she wanted. She was voted the prettiest and most attractive girl in her high school class. So let's talk a little bit about their marriage. When he started writing the books, of course, he used their marriage and himself and Zelda in the books, and he wrote their characters based on theirs. And as you see, sometimes he was wondering whether Zelda and I are real or whether we are characters in one of my novels, because, he wrote them pretty close. Of course, he took some artistic license, but they had a whirlwind romance, which I'll get into more details on that a little bit later. They married April 3rd, 1920. So pretty much they were famous for being famous. The press loved following them. They had all those wild parties in hotels. They got kicked out of the Biltmore for swimming in the fountains. And I'm afraid, there was a lot of alcohol, and I mean a lot, even though it wasn't allowed. There was a lot of alcohol involved, which, kind of might spoil your judgment a little, and at some point Zelda would get a little wild and decide that she would perform a striptease for their friends. So she's just a wild child. She's going to do what she wants. They're also known for dancing on top of cabs, running through hotel lobbies, and just being wild. A lot of long parties, as you see in Gadsby, those parties are based on how they were living at the time. Non-stop fun. So here we are. This is Scott in 1913. He enters Princeton, and he becomes a leading figure in their literary world there. He writes for the newspaper, he writes for clubs, he writes for the Triangle, he even writes a play. He writes a lot. The problem is he's more interested in the writing and the social scene than his actual academics. I wonder what could go wrong. So he was actually put on the first semester academic probation. And he had to go to summer school in order to attend the next fall. So that's 1913. But he did have a good time writing and learning social dynamics, how that game is played, how the rich boys and girls play, He's very interested in that kind of social world, and more like, how can I get in there? That kind of thing. So eventually, he gets permanently kicked out of Princeton because his grades are terrible and he doesn't show up for class because he's busy doing these other things. So he decides that in November of 1917, he's going to join the army. And he gets stationed in Montgomery, Alabama, where he meets young Zelda, Sayre. There were a lot of officers around at the time. He was in officer training. But he neglected a lot of his training so he could write a book. So this is the same story. He wanted to be an officer, but he wanted to write his book a little more, and then he was interested in going out with the local girls and to dances and all that kind of social scene. So we're seeing a pattern set up. So didn't quite make officer because he was busy. So when he met Zelda, Zelda found him very interesting because he talked about literature and books and art and things that the local boys never even touched upon, He talked about very interesting and worldly things, and she just thought that was awesome. But when they first went to the dance and he walked her home, he says, "Can I have your phone number?" And she goes, "Well, no, I'm not interested in guys that work really, or men that work really fast. No, I'm not giving you my phone number." And so he asks again. And so she gives him his phone number. Now, he kept calling her house every day for 2 weeks, and she wouldn't pick it up. The maid would pick it up and say, somebody's on the phone for you. She ignored him, which was a good strategy on her part to ignore him because, nothing's more interesting than her ignoring him. So they finally went out, and they got along great. And so Zelda invited him to dinner with the judge and the mother and the sisters. And the judge asked him, what are your prospects, young man? What are you planning on doing with your life? And he said he was going to be the best writer in the whole world. And then the judge says, well, that doesn't sound like you're going to be able to provide properly for Zelda. Your income as a writer is just not barely going to make ends meet. And I must tell you, young man, I don't see a future. So pretty much, and it's in Gatsby, rich girls don't marry poor boys. But Zelda, being Zelda, agreed to become secretly engaged to him anyway, in spite of the dad, in spite of whatever. She's like, I'm going to do this. So they sent Scott to New York to get staged and ready, possibly go over to the war. And he and Zelda would write letters back and forth. They wrote a lot of letters. This is before email, this is before text. This is proper English, full sentences. I love you. Kind of very passionate, wonderful letters. If you get a chance, their daughter, Scotty, put together a book, Love Scott, Love Zelda, and it's their letters back and forth, and it's very, very nice. So that started a lifetime of them writing back and forth to each other. Well, either accidentally or on purpose, Zelda sent Scott a letter that was intended for another man. Could have been an accident. I don't know, she writes a lot of letters to a lot of people. Or it might have been on purpose. So Scott comes flying back down to there, and they have a massive fight over this. And Zelda goes, well, you're just silly. You are overreacting, you're silly, and you don't know what you're talking about. Breaks off the engagement. Well, the army, in its good sense, since there was an armistice and they decided they weren't going to have a war anymore, let Scott go his own way, and he decided that the only way to get Zelda was to become a good writer and to earn that income. So he decides he's going to New York. Well, he became an advertisement man, and he was making $70 a week or something, which is not a whole lot even back then. Still not enough for her. So after they had had that confrontation and he had got that job and he was tired of writing the advertisements, he was totally tired of that kind of writing. He meant that he was going to really write, and since Zelda's not going to do anything with me until I become a world famous writer, what he did was he quit his job, and with his last couple pennies, he got really drunk. And he went home to St. Paul. And he went home and he picked up that book that he started writing in the army. And he continued to write that at that time. There's Zelda's title, The Side of Paradise. So they had broken up, and when this book actually got published, it was a massive success. It spoke to the times, because what I would kind of consider it now is like a young adult novel. These are college age young adults. So he is writing the experience that these young adults are having at this time, in this time period, with what's going on socially and everything else. But this book hit big, and he made it big. So then he comes back, but he wanted to come back with money jingling in his pockets for Zelda. So he started writing little articles and other things. Besides getting this, he would write some articles for Saturday Evening Post and things like that to make enough money that when he went to see Zelda, his pockets would be bulging with that money. And so what happens is they get married. And when they do get married, her folks do not come to the wedding. They had their little wedding there in New York, and then they started partying and having these massive, crazy parties at the Biltmore and having all their friends come and for these extended weekends, and these parties would last days on end, and then they would do their fountain swimming and their crazy stuff. But along in October of 1921, Zelda was finding out she was having a baby. And Scott was hoping it would be a boy to carry on his legacy, you know. This is gonna be a boy, and it's gonna be great. Well, he was a little disappointed that this baby was not a boy. So they decided to name her Frances Scott, or Scotty Fitzgerald for short, instead of his name. Now, back in the day, let's say that there was some kind of ether or pain-killing substance they gave women when they were in labor, correct? And when Zelda was coming kind of out of it, she asked, you know, what is the baby? And they said, it's a girl. And she goes, oh, a girl. I hope that she is a beautiful little fool. Meaning that in those days, they still had the same expectations of women that you were to be the homemakers and such, and Zelda didn't want much to do with that. So if she was a fool and she could hide all of her intelligence or skills or whatever, she might be happier than poor Zelda was, because Zelda was getting a little squashed at that time. But at the time they had Scotty, Zelda didn't know much about household management, shall we say, because she grew up with servants and stuff. So she didn't even know how to cook. Zelda does not know how to cook. She doesn't know anything. One time Scott finds all of his dirty clothes are piled up in a closet. And he's like, what are these doing here? And she goes, I didn't know what to do with them. I don't know. I just didn't want them here. So she puts them. So they ended up hiring a cook and a nanny. So, you know, poor Scotty would be taken care of, because Zelda didn't want much to do with any of that. That was not what she was interested in at all. So in 1920, shortly after they had Scotty, poor Zelda started to have issues. She started to have bladder infection. She started to get really sick. And also she started to feel the stress and the strain, and maybe fame isn't so great, and maybe having to try to deal with having a kid and a husband, and Scott's getting all the accolades and all the things. It was putting a mental toll on her as well. So she started to show some early signs that things were not well with her, plus having those infections and things, to the point where they couldn't have another child because she had those health issues. But when Scotty grew up, she was interviewed by the newspaper, and they said, well, how was it growing up with those two, you know, with all the partying and the alcohol and the, you know, crazy fights they would have? I mean, knockdown, dragging, screaming fights. And Scotty said, well, they always kept that away from me. I had no idea any of that stuff went on. You know, I saw them a couple hours a day, and they never had me around when the parties were happening and whatever. She said I had a great childhood. So good on them to not get her involved in all the things that were going on there. So the next book that comes out is The Beautiful and the Damned, 1922. And this is where Scott pretty much lifts some lines directly from Zelda's journals. And she wasn't very happy about that at all. She was kind of angry because she didn't like the way the women are now being depicted in this book, because the first book is fun, and the ladies are great and, wonderful people. In this one, he's starting to have the female characters are being money hungry, they're being greedy, they're really, really horrible women. And this is the way he's writing them. And Zelda didn't appreciate that. She's like, are you modeling that off of me or my friends? I don't like this. And then the press continuously are saying, well, you're his muse, you're his inspiration and stuff. And she didn't want to be that. She didn't want to be a stereotype. She didn't want to be known just as his muse because he took her words, put them in that book. So what had happened is a New York magazine interviewed her about the book, and she wrote a pretty funny interview, but during it she goes, I do think that I see some of my journals written, some of the lines from my journals are appearing in this book, and maybe a few words from my letters. And that's when she said, Mr. Fitzgerald seems to believe that plagiarism starts at home. And the way she wrote was funny, but it was also kind of saying, hey. Now we get to Gatsby. In 1925, so he looked at her the way all women want to be looked at by a man. So he's putting out his most romantic ideas, his most inspirational ideas, and the idea of getting the unattainable woman, the woman of his dreams, but she's still unattainable. He's going to try hard. He's going to, put the idea of success and the American dream and coming from nothing and making something of yourself. And he's going to add that part of himself into that book. But he's also going to add a lot of the relationship between Zelda and himself and how he's kind of soured a little bit on success and their relationship and how things are going with that. So that kind of gets put in that book as well. So in 1924, while he's still working on this book, he locks himself away. They are out in New England and they're in a country house, and she's swimming and she meets a French aviator, and she kind of likes him, and she decides that she's going to ask Scott for a divorce. And he is outraged, of course, and he locks her in her bedroom until she says she no longer wants a divorce, and he goes after this guy. Well, the guy had already left town, this Edward, and his story is that it was nothing like that, and her story is that she was totally in love with him, and she wanted to leave Scott, to the point where she said, okay, I won't get a divorce, but she accidentally, possibly, but she did overdose on sleeping pills. So that was a major depressive episode that she just had before this book came out. And quite a bit of drama within their relationship, which all these things tend to spill over from their real life into his writings. The whole time, though, Scott is still struggling with alcohol. Sometimes he thinks that alcohol helps him write, but really it might not. A lot of times he's just more interested in the drinking part of it. Scott also suffers from major writer's block, to the point where he would wake up at night in a cold sweat like, I'm never going to write again, I won't be successful, this is all over type anxiety. But he made his way through it, and he wrote the things out in Gatsby. So the character of Daisy, of course, is Zelda, or a reasonable facsimile, very similar. But the way he writes Daisy is that she is shallow, materialistic, and he just really dives into that character, almost like he's attacking Zelda at this point, like all you care about is money, this is all you want to do, this is what this character is, this is what all women are type thing going on. And then of course he writes Gatsby is like himself, that he had grown up poor roots. Gatsby's idea in the book anyway, nobody's quite sure how Gatsby makes his money. I mean, he could be a criminal, he could be a bootlegger and such. And in Scott's case, it's the writing is where he's trying to make his money. So those are similarities between both of them. Scott and Gatsby both served in the military, and that's where they met the women, their loves. So he's adding things from his own life into this story. So we'll see a couple more things that are very similar. So he wrote a lot about his relationship with Zelda into these. Zelda, definitely a major inspiration. He wrote that like both the character Daisy and Zelda, both women were ultimately superficial and disinterested in their partners for much of their relationships and unattainable, resulting in tragic outcomes of the men. And both Gatsby and Fitzgerald pursued wealth, but in different ways. So he's writing about them. Now, here's Daisy / Zelda. She's charming, she's beautiful, she's flirtatious, she's independent, all the things that Zelda is. Scott, when they first met, called Zelda a true original. There was only one of her, which in the beginning was fun. Maybe not so fun later on. He didn't appreciate her being original. But that's where the line in the book comes when Daisy has her baby. I hope she's a fool, a beautiful little fool, is directly from what Zelda said. And while Zelda's words don't directly appear, they're pretty close. Some of the quotes and philosophies that Zelda talked about appear the same as Daisy, the same ideas about life, but only he gives it more of a darker slant. All right, now let's talk about Scott. Scott and Gatsby, like I said before, both middle-class beginnings, both trying to earn wealth, both trying to live the American dream, both trying to work their ways up through the social system and monetarily. And again, Gatsby and even the Fitzgeralds would be seen as new rich because, you know, they built for themselves. They weren't moneyed people. They are the upstarts. And you see that also in the book where New Egg is Gatsby's place. He lives there. That's the new rich coming up, and somehow they're not seen as well as, you know, the people that are moneyed. So Gatsby is pretty much considered an upstart in that case. So the creative influence and rivalry, again, was plagiarism begins at home. So when Zelda was asked to write a review of Scott's work, Gatsby this time, she says, "It seems to me that on one page I recognize a portion of my old diary that came up missing shortly after we got married." So it just seems very vaguely familiar to me. In fact, Mr. Gerald, I believe that is how he spells his name. I believe, you know, it seems to me that he thinks plagiarism starts at home. So I think that's how he spells his name. Zelda's starting to resent this now. At first she thought it was great. He is just honoring me, putting my ideas in this book, and it's great. It's great to see myself in this book, and it's great. But Scott wants to control all of her stuff, and he wants to be the writer. He does not want her to do anything on her own. He wants to have the idea that he can take her writings and his too, to the point where when Zelda was asked to write quite a few little short articles here and there, he would only let her if it had his byline on it. So it would be Scott Fitzgerald and Mrs. Fitzgerald when she would go to write these articles, which started to get really, really annoying to Zelda because she was a good writer in her own right, and she really didn't appreciate that he wanted to edit her articles that she wrote. He wanted complete control over what she was allowed to write and submit to these articles. And she's starting to resent this, so it's causing more friction in that marriage. So much so that Zelda wrote her own book in 1930, and it's called Save Me the Waltz. And it's the same story as The Beautiful and the Damned, but from her perspective. So it takes things from her point of view because she felt it was unfair the way that he took her real life experiences and he used them in his books and put his own little signature twist on it, and she didn't appreciate it. So she writes her own book, but unfortunately it really wasn't reviewed well in its time, but it is a counter story to what he had done. So in 1926, it's after Gatsby, 26, Zelda gets hospitalized for what is likely a mental breakdown. So she actually goes to an institution. And the problems back then, they didn't do a really great job in that area, and everyone has schizophrenia. That was the diagnosis, everybody. They didn't have any ways to, break down exactly what it is. You just have schizophrenia. So they decided that they would do things like starvation treatment, cold-hot treatment. If they could just shock the system back in order, then everything would be back in order. If they could physically shock that system, they thought, the brain would restart, and unfortunately that causes its own issues. So she goes to a psychiatric institute in France, and writing therapy was recommended, and that's where she wrote this book while she was actually institutionalized, and they said writing therapy was her recommendation, so that's when she started writing her book. She and Scott, anytime that she was hospitalized, would write these letters back and forth. They still wrote letters to each other back and forth, back and forth. So that was like a lifelong thing that they did. So as soon as she was better and released, they continued their travels. And during this time, Zelda decides, now she had taken ballet as a teen. She was a pretty good dancer. She had taken lessons or something. So they're in France with the expatriate artists and dancers, and Scott takes up a friendship with Hemingway at this time. Hemingway is not writing just yet, but the two of them become buddies. And Zelda is feeling left out, that she is not part of that. She's not contributing to the art world. She's not doing what they're doing. She's kind of jealous and feeling left out. So she decides she's going to start her ballet again, to the point where she gets so obsessed with it that she is practicing 10 hours a day to do this. And that's starting also to take a toll. Now, back in those days, I thought everybody had schizophrenia, but in retrospect and with modern diagnosis, it was probably bipolar disorder, where you're extremely high or extremely low. And in this case, if she is obsessed and doing 10 hours of ballet to the point where she is physically and mentally exhausted, that's the manic phase with her. So she continues to have these issues. So she has some setbacks, and the next time she goes back to the hospital, she starts painting. Now, her paintings are pretty nice. They're pretty interesting. She made little paper dolls for Scotty, and she made them of Scott and herself, and little paper dolls, and they're nice to look at too. So if you can get a hold of one of her art books, they're very nice. It reminds me of like Georgia O'Keeffe or something like that. So she has all this ability, but Scott's kind of tamping this down because he wants to be the writer. He wants to be the famous one, and he wants to have control over pretty much everything, including Zelda and how their story goes. And she's starting to feel that pinch. So during this time, they go to a party, and drunken Scott decides he's going to flirt with Isadora Duncan. And if you're familiar with her, she is a dancer. And at this time, Zelda's trying to be a dancer, so she is extremely jealous. But instead of yelling and screaming and hollering, poor Zelda decides that she is going to throw herself down the stairs, down this embankment, that this is her reaction to this. And she ends up getting bruised and cut up. So her reaction was, well, I'm just going to throw myself down these stone steps. And it was quite a ways. So again, she's having some serious mental health issues at this time. So Zelda's in and out of psychiatric care. So from 1932 through 1935, Zelda is almost constantly in psychiatric treatment. And she spends some time in Switzerland and in the United States. And to Scott's credit, he's trying to get her the best help he can. And the bills are racking up, and he's not really had a hit book in a little while. So what Scott does, he writes this book, and it's called Tender is the Night. And this is about a psychologist who falls in love with his female patient. And it's about them and the relationship and how he's trying to take care of her. So this book is about that aspect of their life because he's always writing about what's happening. But they never do divorce. And all the times that Zelda is institutionalized, they write letters back and forth. Not to say that he isn't like taking things from the letters and using them elsewhere. He may or may not be. So this book is also about the 1920s, and it starts talking about themes like love and ambition, but also the disillusionment of sometimes when you make it and you think you have it all, that maybe it's not all what it's cracked up to be. Maybe that's not really what you should have been doing in the first place. So this book kind of gets into that kind of disillusionment of maybe it's not all cracked up to be rich, and to have that decadent lifestyle that they had in the 20s. It was well received by the critics, but not a commercial success. So that means that poor Scott, he's running up bills, he's in trouble, he can only get, his publishers will no longer give him advances. He's in financial trouble. So the solution is to go out to Hollywood. And he is offered a lot of money to screenwrite for MGM. But when he gets there the first time, they're there in 1927, and he was going to write a film called Three Comrades. But during that time, he was soon let go, and I wonder if you can guess why. Drinking. He started drinking again, started drinking in earnest, to the point where he was missing time. He wasn't going in. He wasn't giving his quota pages or whatever they wanted from him. He wasn't showing up. So he had a disappointed effort there. And then in 1931, he has another short stint as a freelance writer in Hollywood again. This time he has a little more success. He's trying to be on the wagon. He's trying really hard. He's making his bills now. He's starting to pay off the creditors for all the loans and all the things, and for Zelda's hospitalizations. He's doing all right. I mean, still got the bills. There's always the bills. But again, he gets that from his father, where he wasn't a very good businessman. So his love-hate relationship with money kind of gets him into trouble there. But he does have a moderate success there. But he does meet this Sayre Graham. She is a gossip columnist from the UK. And she writes many articles. And Scott's still married to Zelda, but he started living with her. And what had happened was, she is 8 years younger, but what had happened, he had had a heart attack. And they suggested that he not go up and down stairs. So her apartment's on the first floor, so naturally they kind of moved in together before that was a thing. It was very scandalous. I guess she could write a column about herself in that case. But unfortunately, that was in 1937. Unfortunately, in 1940, Scott has a massive heart attack, and he actually dies in her house at breakfast. And, they're together. They loved each other, and it was just a heartbreak there. Very few people actually went to his funeral. Very few. And the daughter, Scotty, said, I don't want you to come to her. And that's also understandable. So it was, his health concerns mainly was a lot of alcoholism and not taking care of himself, and that kind of stress on your body. And plus trying to get your bills paid, and you can't because you're going around circles with yourself as far as that goes. And here is poor Zelda. Her final hospitalization in 1947, she was in Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. And what had happened there, the night nurse had sedated some patients and locked them in their room. A fire started, and they couldn't get to them. So unfortunately, and she was among them, the 7 perished because, I sincerely hope that things are better now, that you wouldn't lock sedated people into a room, and hopefully they have sprinklers, I don't know. But tragically, yes, and it's very sad, and yeah, it was tragic. By the time Zelda was in this last hospitalization, due to all the things that they'd done to her, like the denying of the food, the cold treatments, the hot treatments, all the things, she actually received electroshock therapy. So at this time, unfortunately, she was not herself anymore. The spark wasn't there. She wasn't Zelda anymore. So what happened to them? As you see, there's Scotty, their daughter. She grew up. She was an American writer and a journalist, and she was their only child. And she graduated from Vassar College, and she worked for the Washington Post and the New Yorker and other publications, and she became a prominent member of the Democratic Party. And in her later years, she became a critic of biographers and their depictions of her parents' marriage. And she particularly objected to biographies that depicted her father as a domineering husband who drove his wife insane, or the crazy wife that drove the husband to drink. She really fought back against that. And she also published the book of Zelda's paintings and their love letters between each other, which was very sweet. So she had a successful life. She has 2 daughters. So she wrote a final coda about her parents to a biographer. She says, "I have never been able to buy the notion that it was my father's drinking which led her to the sanitarium, nor do I think she led him to the drinking." Scotty died of throat cancer in 1986, and she was 64. So in Gadsby, this line, "So we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." That quote is also on the tombstone of both of them. Scott and Zelda are buried together in St. Paul, and that is there because Scott always wanted to recapture the past, and you just can't. You can't. Okay, so that's it. I hope you learned some good things here.